Alright, so in this lesson of the political ideas section of government and politics, we're going to be going over one of the new right thinkers called Ayn Rand. One of my personal favourites, has a very good and very interesting philosophy. It's quite a thing to sink your teeth into though, because her books are fairly long, so they're not for the faint-hearted. But I digress. Ayn Rand is perhaps one of the most important right-wing philosophers of the 20th century, and I believe after this lesson you'll be able to understand why. So for those of you who don't know, the New Right was essentially the form of right-wing politics that was really taking root in the 1980s under the administration of Ronald Reagan in America, who was elected in 1980, and Margaret Thatcher in Britain, who was elected in 1979. Now, as anyone who knows about Rand already, you know that she despises Ronald Reagan, in spite of the fact that he advocated for a lot of the same economic policies that she supported. She was vehemently anti-Christian and essentially anti-tribalism. She believed in the sanctity of an individual reasoning and coming to their own conclusion. So that's enough of an introduction. So we're going to go over Ayn Rand, who lived between 1905 and 1982. Rand's life and the basics of Objectivism, which is her philosophy. Ayn Rand was born in Russia prior to the revolution in 1917 to a Jewish middle-class family in St. Petersburg. She was fortunately able to escape the tyranny of the communists when she travelled to America in 1925 to meet a family member, and she was able to obtain American citizenship by marrying Frank O'Connor. So obviously she needed to escape Russia, because if she did not, her fate as quite a mouthy, laissez-faire capitalist girl, obviously in a Leninist Russia, not going to end well. You're going to get lined up against the wall and supposedly to the Bolsheviks, get your due justice, but I personally disagree. Anyway, she detested the Russian Bolsheviks, and all communists by that matter, as she believed them to be morally corrupt, and she was a radical proponent of free market capitalism. This essentially means lack of centralized control, so the government has little to do with the economy. The economy just kind of gets on its own, and prices are regulated by the invisible hand of the free market. So, contrary to popular belief, she was not a libertarian. She distanced herself from this ideology as she believed it was inconsistent and lacked the integrity of her philosophy. Rand was the founder of a philosophy called Objectivism, which supported individualism, laissez-faire capitalism, the minarchist state, objective morality, and atomism. I believe they're all pretty much self-explanatory. A minarchist state is essentially the same as a night watchman state. It has very little power and mainly exists to protect the negative liberties of individuals that it governs, and the negative liberty is just a freedom from, as opposed to a freedom to, which is a positive liberty. Objective morality is self-explanatory, and atomism is the idea that a society is not comprised of some kind of extra force that is the group. It is just a loosely knit collective of individuals, which is contrary to the socialist belief that society is inherently collective, which essentially means that there is a collective will, as opposed to just a load of individuals having their own wills. So, she was a vehement anti-communist, as we've just said. Her book, We the Living, discussed life under Lenin in Russia, and it was adapted into a film in Italy that was shown in Mussolini's fascist state, as it was believed to be purely anti-communist propaganda. But it was banned when Mussolini discovered the film's true ideals, being those of Objectivism, and as we will get into, you'll be able to see that Objectivism is very, very different to fascism. So obviously the fascists aren't going to like it being a popular film in their country, spreading the messages of Objectivism and laissez-faire capitalism. So, now we're going to go and have a look at one of her most famous books, Atlas Shrugged. We'll go over two of the most famous books in this lesson because I believe they are the best way to really put forth the ideology of Objectivism, and it'll give you a much better understanding of what it is, and it'll give you examples of texts that you can write about in your essays. So, Atlas Shrugged is Ayn Rand's most acclaimed work. It's an extremely long book, longer than Les Miserables, that presents the protagonist, Dagny Taggart, as a rugged individual, attempting to keep her railway, Taggart Transcontinental, afloat as an incompetent socialist government in America is constantly trying to tax, nationalize, and ridicule her company, calling it immoral, in spite of the fact that it is fundamental to the survival of the nation. The book shows the flaws in the socialist moral philosophy, which condemns the industrialists as robber barons, whom are responsible for the economic woes faced by the population. The woes which, in fact, have been caused by centralized planning, which has put numerous businesses out of business. Now, to put that into layman's terms, centralized planning is essentially Keynesian economics in action. So the government is controlling what is being produced, the government is controlling prices, and obviously as they lack the localized knowledge of local business owners, they're not really going to be able to have much ability to judge these things properly, so it ultimately causes economic strife, as the government simply do not have all the information needed to properly make the decisions that they would be making under a centrally planned economy. And where I've said about how it shows the inconsistency with the socialist philosophy calling industrialists robber barons, that essentially means how socialists ridicule people's selfishness, and they say that that's a bad thing. An objectivist strongly disagrees. They believe that selfishness is a very good thing, as it's an integral part of their philosophy, namely the principle that an individual should act in their rational self-interest at all times. So, as a result of this repression of the industrialists, they begin to disappear out of the blue and abandon their businesses to the bureaucrats in the government. Essentially, a secession of the plebs were they to be industrialists. Dagny Taggart believes the industrialists are being convinced to resign by a mysterious destroyer whom breaks their spirit in an argument in their office. And the man supposedly, I'll just say supposedly now, so we'll get into it later, carries cigarettes with the sign of the dollar, which happens to be the commonly used symbol of Objectivism, a golden dollar. So, Dagny develops a relationship with a steel manufacturer called Hank Reardon, and they have an affair behind the back of Hank Reardon's wife. Their affair is portrayed as being morally acceptable, as Hank's wife is not in love with him, and it is suggested that an individual should follow their passions above any social duties or obligations. So in this case it would be the social duty to not cheat on your wife, in spite of the fact that they are really not interested in the relationship. That's a basic summary. It's not really true. If you read the book, it's a bit more complicated than that, but you don't really need to know more if you're going to include this in your essay. Hank and Dagny go on a trip to an abandoned factory where they discover an engine that runs on static electricity that would change the world, but it has been abandoned. The engine had been abandoned by a man named John Galt, who believed that the world was not currently deserving enough of such an innovation. Dagny eventually forms a relationship with John Galt, and they travel to a secret valley called Galt's Gulch, where the industrialists were running their own businesses for their own pleasure outside of the range of the government. So this is where all the industrialists have gone, because they want to take the credit and they want their own personal satisfaction from running their own businesses their own way. The book ends with America being plunged into a new Wild West, as the government has lost all legitimacy and power, as the government cannot run without the industrialists. The end of the book is actually quite sad, because I believe one of the central characters of the book, whose name eludes me right now, as it's been a while since I've read it, ends up... Essentially, it's suggested that he dies in the middle of the desert as a result of the fact that he refuses to leave the past and leave Taggart Transcontinental. So it's got him desperately trying to keep a train going, although it is broken down. I believe his name is Eddie Whistler, but I may be wrong. Sorry, Eddie Willers, that's his name. Apologies. So, that's the basic story of Atlas Shrugged. It's a very long book, so I really haven't done it justice. But we're going to have a look at one specific part of the book that is very important to understanding Objectivism. The 20th Century Motor Company. There's a story within Atlas Shrugged in which a homeless stowaway on the Comet, Taggart Transcontinental's fastest train, and this homeless man converses with Dagny about the time he spent working at the 20th Century Motor Company. That's essentially the area where Dagny and Hank Reardon find the engine created by John Galt. So this tale is a damning indictment of the notion that it is moral to promote the idea of from each according to his ability to each according to his need. The man discusses that following the death of the founder of the company, his children took the reins of leadership and subsequently changed the structure of the company so that the workers would be working for themselves and not for the profit of the industrialists. So essentially, they created a small worker co-op that would be governed by the dictatorship of the proletariat. So, profits from the company were now not distributed to those whom worked the hardest and so produced the most goods, but to those whom needed it the most. The man asserts that this system made the workers morally contemptible, and they now hated one another. This is because the most skilled workers were working overtime to produce engines that would be sold to pay for the needs of others. The list of whom deserved the money would most based on their needs was recorded at hectic meetings where the workers would argue that they were the neediest worker among the crowd. This meant that people were constantly working overtime to pay for the costs of their co-workers, new babies, for their co-workers' broken arms, limbs, and their co-workers' living expenses. This dynamic resulted in the workers becoming angry at the news of a new baby, where they formally congratulated the man and chipped in to pay for the expenses of childbirth. And there were rumours of some workers killing an old lady who broke her hip to avoid working overtime for the medical costs that they would be bound to fulfill. So, eventually, the quality of the engines dropped and no one would buy them, so the company went out of business. John Galt worked at this company, but he left the moment the socialist children proposed their new strategy to, and I quote, combat the oppression of the workers. The remaining families in the secluded town now live in squalor, and that's when Dagny arrives in the town when she finds the engine produced by John Galt all those years ago. So, now we're going to go on to Ayn Rand's second most acclaimed work, The Fountainhead. So, the protagonist of The Fountainhead is a man named Howard Rourke, who is a young architect. The book essentially focuses on the objectivist ideal of a competent man who is passionate about his work and works for his own pleasure, as opposed to working for anyone else. Howard Rourke is a phenomenal architect, but he has some growing pains at the beginning of his career due to the fact that he refuses to take any suggestions of the building's design from his clients and will only design a building if he has full control over its final design. This shows that Rourke has integrity, and he is unwilling to have his design ruined in his eyes by the democratizing force of compromise. He is the sole dictator of how his means of production are used. This is the very soul of capitalism, the voluntary exchange of goods decided by the individual. Your mind is your means of production if you are an architect. As opposed to being the people's means of production, which essentially means you are owned by the dictatorship of the proletariat, which would happen under socialism or communism. So, the antithesis of Rourke's character is another young architect called Peter Keating, who is willing to compromise in order to get ahead. He does not love being an architect. He loves that people think that he is a successful architect. He cares too much about how others perceive him. In the end, Peter Keating ends up as a mess, as although he has all of the power and influence he desired, he is not proud of his work, and he has lost his individuality. Rourke's unwillingness to compromise is best exemplified with his burning down of Cortlandt, a building he designed for Peter Keating, on the condition that it would not be altered, and when it was altered, Rourke did not want an abomination of his creation to exist. It should be noted that Keating is not a bad guy, and although he's dishonest and has Rourke's design ridiculed, and he has Rourke design some buildings for him on the sly, he respects Rourke and tries to fight back against alterations to Cortlandt. So, the Fountainhead also displays Rand's advocacy of pursuing the passions in a non-hedonistic way, and the notion that an individual is a moral legislator who has the power to alter the social contract with their actions. Rourke's relationship with Dominique Francone is a display of the following: of an individual's rational self-interest in spite of the social contract, rational anarchism to the social contract. Dominique sees the virtue in Rourke's refusal to compromise and his love of doing his work for its own sake. There is another character called Ellsworth Toohey, who is essentially the antagonist of the book. He supports the values of self-sacrifice, something viewed as evil to an objectivist. Rand's philosophy can ultimately be summed up in the advice that one should act in their rational self-interest, and they should reject Immanuel Kant's deontological approach to ethics, which preaches self-sacrifice and the rejection of reason. Obviously, to anyone who knows about Immanuel Kant's story of the man with the axe, saying that you are obliged to return a murderer's axe to him to murder his family, essentially, if he asks for it, because you said that you were only borrowing it temporarily, you are categorically obliged to give it back to him, although that you rationally know that you shouldn't. She instead advocates selfishness and the moral virtues of capitalism. So, a brief summary of Ayn Rand and Objectivism. Her famous works were The Fountainhead, Atlas Shrugged, Anthem, The Virtue of Selfishness, We the Living, and For the New Intellectual. And her core ideas were to act in your own rational self-interest, rational anarchism. She supported a minarchist state. She believed individuals were moral legislators. She believed you should follow your passions. She believed in individualism, atomism, and laissez-faire capitalism. So that has been Ayn Rand. This is one of the longer political ideas sections, but I believe it was necessary as she gives you the best summary of the new right. And if you ever get any questions about this in the exam, she is a phenomenal example to choose, as there is so much substance to talk about. So that's it for Ayn Rand. Robert Heinlein is next lesson. Thank you.